So let's say we're doing participant observation. How do you pick participants to observe? Well, when we're doing a sample, as far as determining who to observe, we really have to think about what types of people do we want to look at, maybe what types of places we want to look at, and what phenomena, in other words, what type of event or behavior or experiences are we trying to capture. And so we don't do a random sample. We specifically pick people based on these things that we want to observe. Obviously, since you're the one doing the observing, you are limited on time and capacity, which means it's going to be a small number. Even if it is a small number, you still have to make sure, though, that it's appropriate to capture, again, not everybody that's affected, but at least enough of a variety to make sure you capture what you want to do. It's very important to understand that participant observation is not meant to be representative. That means that if you're reading a qualitative research study and you notice that there might not be enough men or people of color in a study, that's not necessarily a limitation because, again, the point of the sample is not meant to be able to generalize the findings to the rest of the population, but rather to kind of get a breadth of experiences. So you usually have different types. So you may want to get specific examples that have a lot of detail. Maybe there's just a few cases where it's more or less quote unquote typical. And maybe there are people that are just very different or situations that are very different where you want to provide a contrast. So as an example, you can see this chart, which is really just the first part of the table of these participants in a study of sex workers in Bolivia. And what you can see is that the researcher made sure to identify a few things. Females, you see the researcher marked ages, the profession, and some notes of maybe the role of the person. And all of these were people that were observed in this study. And so you see that the researcher probably picked people based on their age so that there could be a variety of representation in age. You see that there was a sociologist, a health worker, so you see some professionals selected on top of the sex workers. And so you see that this researcher specifically picked different people based on their role to be able to capture what could be considered a typical case, for example, a quote-unquote typical worker, maybe a critical case, maybe some of the people, if there's a sociologist or a social worker that's worked very closely with a lot of sex workers, that might be a great source of information. And there might be even deviant cases. So maybe there might be a sex worker, for example, that if this study is looking at, for example, HIV or STDs, maybe this is a sex worker that has never had one, and that might be considered unusual. So you see, again, the different considerations there. So how is the data collected? Well, there's a couple of methods. It's pretty systematic. So keep in mind, this isn't you have a lot of observation that often happens in other modes, but because this is research, it has to be systematic. There has to be a process. So usually there's a standard form where you're recording what you're observing. Sometimes it's a very specific form. If you're observing attachment, for example, you may have pre-developed an instrument where you're counting the number of times a parent hugs a child, for example. And you're usually looking for certain things, like how often something happens. Who are the people that you're observing? What's going on around you? So here's an example of a participant observation form, often called a field note, where you see just specific things of what they're capturing, what's going on, what questions come up for you. And a lot of the times in the field, people may even use field journals. So they might just have a journal that they carry with them where they follow this process of capturing behavior, what they saw, what they observed, even jotting down pictures. And this is all what they analyze then whenever they sit down to do their data analysis. Now the next form of data collection is called intensive interviewing. And intensive interviewing is a bit different than participant observation because here You are deliberately sitting down and asking open-ended questions. So you're very, very purposely trying to draw out information through words rather than observing actions and behavior and things like that. So you're you're asking a lot of questions. You have a certain set of questions, but you may vary the content or the order. An interviewee might bring up something that you want to dig into, or they might jump ahead to a question in their answer, but you usually are following a specific outline of topics. Again, you want to understand the world as that person sees it in their own terms. And so you can check out the video that looks at a simulated example of an interview done by a researcher in Uganda.